Good evening and welcome to the ZeroHedge debate on capitalism versus socialism, sponsored by JM Bullion. I'm your moderator, Erik Townshend. Many of you know me as the host of Macro Voices, the investing podcast that specifically targets professional finance, family offices, and sophisticated private investors. We have an exciting debate planned for you this evening on a very controversial topic. Which is the better way to govern society and manage the distribution of wealth, capitalism or socialism? And we have two excellent debaters lined up. Arguing in favor of socialism, Professor Ben Burgis is a columnist for Jacobin magazine, an adjunct philosophy professor at Rutgers University, and the author of several books and pamphlets, most, most recently, 4 essays on Palestine. He's appeared on venues ranging from NBC to the Joe Rogan Experience, and he's also co-author with Jacobin editor Bhaskar Sunkara of an economic professor Michael Beggs of the forthcoming book The Blueprint: Life After Capitalism. Professor Burgis, thanks for joining us this evening.
Oh, my
Professor
apologies.
Burgis.
I was just saying, thank you for having me.
Okay. And arguing in favor of capitalism, Keith Knight is managing editor at the Libertarian Institute, the author of Domestic Imperialism, 9 Reasons I Left Progressivism, and the host of the Don't Tread on Anyone podcast. Keith, thanks for joining us.
Erik, I appreciate you having me.
ZeroHedge asked me to give you a Joe Rogan style long form format that really gets into the meat of this issue. So tonight's debate will be organized in 4 separate parts. Part 1 lays out the foundation of what capitalism and socialism are, beginning with opening arguments from each debater, followed by rebuttals. Then we'll move on to 4 foundational questions about these systems: freedom versus equality, leveraging human nature, the historical scorecard of each of these systems, and then finally, the morality and humanity aspects of each system. Part 2 will be a rapid fire series of 5 challenge questions to each debater, requiring each of them to defend some of the most common criticisms of the system that they're each representing. Part 3 will focus on what I'm calling the generational crisis. The fact that regardless of what ism you use to describe the current systems of governance and wealth distribution, the vast majority of young adults agree that that system, whatever it's called, is broken and need of reform. And I happen to agree with them wholeheartedly. Is capitalism the problem and socialism the solution? Or have those who blame capitalism for the injustices in today's society misdiagnosed the problem? Needless to say, our debaters will have strong views to argue on either side of that subject. Then finally, in part 4, our debaters will make their closing arguments, and each will have the opportunity to briefly rebut their opponent's closing arguments. We couldn't possibly get through all of that without setting some time limits, but in the spirit of ZeroHedge's commitment to passionately telling the story and the whole story, each of our debaters have been given an overtime budget of 20 minutes each that they can use to embellish answers to any questions where they feel they need a little bit more time than what we have scripted in the outline. So that means this could be a long one, probably running at least a couple of hours, but I'm confident it's going to be a good one since there's no shortage of passion on the part of either of our debaters. So let's dive right into part 1, starting with opening arguments from Professor Ben Burgis, arguing for socialism. Professor Burgis, please include what the words socialism and capitalism mean to you in your answer, and make your case for why you believe socialism is better. You have 4 minutes for your opening arguments, and Ben, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So when I was invited to this, the title that I was given was, "Is Capitalism a Failed System?" And that's not a simple yes or no question. It depends. Failed at doing what? Capitalism is an economic system where what Marxists call the means of production, things like factories, farms, grocery stores, and warehouses, are privately owned. Put more evocatively, that means it's a system where people with enough money can buy and sell those things like any other commodity or leave them to their children like family heirlooms. Meanwhile, the majority of the population that can't afford them has no realistic way of supporting themselves except by selling their working hours to those who can, and thus following orders all day from an unelected boss. Capitalism is different from feudalism or slavery in that people at the bottom of the society doing the work aren't serfs or slaves. They aren't, the poor aren't the property of the rich. But they are forced by what Marx calls the mute compulsion of economic necessity to rent themselves out to the rich by the hour. Socialists think that the transition from feudalism to capitalism, what we call the bourgeois revolution, was a huge leap forward in human freedom. But we also don't think it goes anything like far enough. A better system would be one where working people collectively owned the means of production and decided together how to divide up the proceeds. That doesn't necessarily mean that everyone would have a totally equal share. Some people might need to be incentivized with a somewhat greater share for taking particularly demanding jobs with lots of stress and responsibility, or conversely for taking particularly dirty and dangerous jobs that nobody wants. But you wouldn't get executives making hundreds of times the salary of the average worker like you do right now. You wouldn't get some individuals, accountable only to wealthy shareholders, authorized to make decisions like closing down plants and throwing hundreds or thousands of people into unemployment and destroying entire communities. Everyone could have a reasonable level of democratic input into the decisions that shape our collective lives. That's the possibility that I'm naming when I talk about socialism. I'm not talking about recreating the Soviet Union. Democratic socialists like me were always opposed to that kind of authoritarianism. I'm talking about extending democracy into the economic sphere. So has capitalism succeeded or failed? Depends. If the mission was bring about economic equality and equal human dignity for everyone, it failed. It's raised the floor, but the distance from the floor to the ceiling is immense and morally indefensible. We live in a society where some people sleep on park benches and some people fly around on private jets. Amazon warehouse workers are subject to nonstop electronic surveillance and routinely skip bathroom breaks to make sure they can make quota, while they're making so much money for their boss that he literally owns his own spaceship. And they're grateful to have those jobs, right? Terrified of losing them. That's your mute compulsion. But one of Marx's most basic insights is that capitalism isn't an avoidable moral mistake, but a necessary stage in historical development. Right? He goes on and on about how much material abundance capitalism has created. The point, though, is that in doing so, it creates the possibility of something better. For the first time in human history, we could have economic equality without that just being the equal sharing of crumbs. But to achieve that, we need to say, good job, capitalism. You succeeded in your mission. Now it's time to go.
Thanks, Ben. Keith Knight, please make your opening arguments, including what socialism and capitalism mean to you and why you believe capitalism is better. The floor is yours, and you have 4 minutes for your opening remarks.
To clarify, when I say communism, I'm referring to the abolition of private property and voluntary contracts. Socialism is most accurately described as the institutionalized aggression against private property and voluntary exchanges. Capitalism is a social system based on the explicit right of private property and voluntary contracts between consenting adults. In advocating capitalism, I'm simply affirming the truism that human beings are self-interested. This is why we are devastated when someone close to us dies, but have trouble getting worked up over the 100,000 deaths that took place during the Franco-Prussian War. Human beings do not stop being self-interested just because they are elected to public office or because they enter a voting booth. The key difference between capitalism and socialism is the constraints faced by self-interested actors. Under a system of private property and voluntary exchange, no one can get a penny out of your pocket or a second of your time unless you voluntarily agree to it. This freedom of association and disassociation is the ultimate check and balance against the inevitable self-interest and greed all human societies operate within. Politicians and state employees are not unpaid volunteers or people who only demand to be paid the bare minimum in order to survive. They too are self-interested. Socialism allows greedy people to take property without consent or without creating any value in exchange through taxing the money other people have acquired voluntarily. This vitally important check and balance, the freedom of association, is also critical to raising living standards. If you don't value a product or service that I create, you have no legal obligation to allocate your scarce time or money to my endeavor. If you want a society where the least well off have the most opportunities, you would want a system which gives those very people the most amount of opportunities to trade and contract with other people in order to raise their living standards. Far from just being theoretical, capitalist enterprises such as Amazon and Walmart have given more people access to low cost products and services than our ancestors ever could have imagined. Companies like Apple have succeeded not because they make products only billionaires can afford, but because they make computers the average person can afford. Henry Ford did not invent the automobile, but in channeling his self interest to meet consumer demand, he made the Model T car affordable to the average worker. Cornelius Vanderbilt lowered the cost of steamship travel from $7 to 6 cents, primarily through capital investment, because he wanted to profit by creating something many people valued. Andrew Carnegie lowered the cost of steel from $56 a ton to $11.50 a ton in 27 years by experimenting and investing in efficient production methods, which everyone else in society benefited from by having an increased access to goods which steel was used to make. Grok, Twitter's artificial intelligence, Wikipedia, Zoom, YouTube, the Khan Academy, Internet Archive, all provide more free access to education than any socialist program any government has ever produced. On a larger scale, we see the same result. In dividing up the Korean peninsula, we see that the Koreans with more freedom to exchange have higher living standards for the average person, just as we saw West Germans have a higher living standard than East Germans, just as we saw the drastic increase in the growth of China when Deng Xiaoping allowed more people to voluntarily trade and contract in the late 1970s. Capitalism harmonizes the self-interest among human beings, not only resulting in higher living standards, but is the only moral system since it rejects the socialist double standard where some people have a right to initiate violence and others do not.
Wow, I have to say that at least Mr. Capitalist knows how to allocate resources, because we gave him 4 minutes and he used 3:59:37. So within a half a second of budget, I got to give Keith credit for that one. But let's give Ben the opportunity to rebut Keith's arguments. Ben, you have 3 minutes to respond to Keith's opening arguments.
Sure. So Keith spent a lot of time talking about the price of various goods that are cheaply offered on markets. And I think that it's interesting to think, especially because one of his examples was Amazon, of course, is a primarily delivery company, about the cheapest way that you can get things delivered, which is by the United States Postal Service. That we will take a letter from Southern California to rural Alaska for 73 cents, and in fact keeps on having legal limitations imposed by Congress on what it can do, out of fear that if it's allowed to offer too many services, this will be dangerous for private competitors. That they won't be able to compete with the prices that the post office can offer. Now, that's a striking example. I wouldn't conclude from that example that that every single aspect of the economy can be run in the way that the USPS is. That we don't need sort of market competition or market mechanisms for anything. I think that would be much too much to conclude from that case. But we also do want to separate the issue about markets from the issue about capitalism. Markets have existed long before capitalism existed. In fact, for most of settled human history, right, since the agricultural revolution. What makes capitalism distinctive is not that there are markets going on, but again, the private ownership of the means of production. That's the distinctive feature of capitalism. And I find it very telling that in sort of stories like the one that you just heard Keith tell, this is something I very commonly hear from libertarians. They describe capitalist economies as if the only sort of interesting economic relationship happening were between sellers and consumers in the sphere of distribution, and what happens in the sphere of production. How most of the population has to spend half their day simply gets disappeared from the picture.
And Keith, you now have 3 minutes to respond to Ben's opening arguments.
Claiming that what makes capitalism unique is the private ownership in the means of production assumes that what we have are some people who are not necessarily accountable. Please correct me if this is not an accurate characterization. We have a very few number of people making decisions for a very large number of people. When it comes to the FDA, the Department of Education, the Pentagon, the NHS in Britain, we see the same thing in government institutions. The difference is those few elites don't have to respond to consumer demand. They don't have to get money voluntarily. So it's not unique to capitalism that very few people make the vast amount of decisions that apply to a large number of people. So if we look at someone like Donald Trump, would you rather him operate in a free market where he can't get a penny out of your pocket unless you voluntarily give it to him, or have the right to make executive orders? We can see that if we take one person and just change the incentives that they face, it turns what could be a very good person into a totally greedy person because you shield them from free market accountability. As far as the poor staying poor and only having jobs to work at, of course, we have statistics on income mobility. The more capitalist a nation is, the more income mobility there is as a causal result of there being more capitalists demanding employment for your services. The employees have more options. They therefore have more leverage. Just because you enter the workforce getting paid minimum wage, once you acquire skills, you're not getting paid minimum wage 10, 20, 30 years after. When it comes to collective decision making, this is called the iron law of oligarchy, where if you have a union and you've executed all the bosses, if you have a union, not everyone wants to go to the union meeting. Not everyone's going to speak up at the meeting. Not everyone's an equally good communicator. And anyone who spreads their ideas is not going to be equally as persuasive to the union as a whole. So you end up with a very small number of people having a disproportionate amount of power. The same criticism applies. There is no such thing as a democracy because you always get a few number of people having much more institutional power than everyone else. This is why AOC is significantly more powerful and has more social status and money than all of her constituents combined, probably. In the case of inequality, obviously ushering in a state that gets to coercively fund operations increases the amount of inequality in society. The government spends like $6.27 trillion a year, and socialists want it to grow even bigger. That is much more unequal to whatever the biggest company in the world is. One note on Amazon and the post office. In 1844, Lysander Spooner created the American Mail Letter Company, and it was outlawed because it was a competitor to the U.S. Postal Service's monopoly on first-class mail. So when the socialist tries to go against the voluntary sector by saying it could potentially lead to monopolies, they inevitably create a situation where the state grants some people a monopoly, which comes at the expense of consumers. That's my response.
Now we're going to move on to 4 foundational questions, starting with freedom versus equality. Capitalism is often associated with individual freedom and choice, while socialism is linked to equality and fairness. Is freedom versus equality the right way to frame this issue? Would Ben admit that socialism might limit some freedoms to achieve equality? And would Keith concede that capitalism's freedom can sometimes lead to big inequalities? And how do each of you balance freedom and equality in your ideal system? Let's again start with Professor Ben Burgis. Ben, you have 2 minutes.
Yeah, I think the whole idea that moving from capitalism to socialism would sacrifice freedom for equality is very common, but I don't actually think it makes any sense. To see why, let's start by thinking about what people who say this mean by freedom. They mean freedom from interference. I have a right to do with what I like with my person and my property, so long as I'm not infringing on the right of others to do likewise. The problem with this is that as an argument in defense of capitalist property rights, an argument against the redistribution of wealth or nationalizing Fortune 500 companies, or any of the other things socialists like myself might propose, it's hopelessly circular. Libertarians and socialists typically agree that we have a right to our persons. That's why many libertarians and nearly all leftists believe in a women's right to choose, for example. But the controversy is about property rights. When the libertarian says you have a right to against having your property interfered with, what does your mean? They can't mean the property you have a legal right to. Otherwise, if a future socialist government passed the Nationalizing Amazon Act, libertarians couldn't object on the grounds that Jeff Bezos' property was being taken away, because it would no longer be property that was legally his. So they have to mean that you have a right to whatever property you're morally entitled to. But now they're just saying you have a moral right to whatever property you have a moral right to. It's completely vacuous and uninformative. The real argument has nothing to do with freedom from interference. It's what property do people have a moral right to? What's the right theory of justice in the distribution of property? And once we put aside this red herring about freedom from interference, that's what the real argument is entirely about.
And Keith, how do you balance freedom and equality in your ideal system? You have 2 minutes to respond.
I would compare the amount of equality to government services and the amount of equality in generally referred to as market services. Socialists are constantly claiming that, well, there is huge inequality in schools. Some schools don't get enough money, and some schools have very bad outcomes. Well, these are more commonly owned by the state. When it comes to the justice system, the courts have a legal monopoly on issuing justice, as well as a legal monopoly on the police. Not just any company has the right to go around arresting people. So when the state provides something, we clearly see the massive inequality that's created. Compare that to the market inequality. Yes, Bezos, I'm sure, has a better car and a better computer and better wine and a better microphone than I do. But is it that much better? It's still absolutely amazing that I have access to things that our ancestors never could have dreamed of, primarily as a causal result of capital investment and the competition that the marketplace provides. So that is how I would weigh. If I said equality was my goal, I would look at whether or not the state provides equality in the first place, and then compare it to the amount of equality that a capitalist system has yielded in certain sectors. So I don't see the state as a solution to the inequality. I see it as primarily the cause of much more inequality, because when they make laws, they don't ring up my phone. They tend to ring up someone who's very influential, someone with a lot of institutional power. So this increases the disparity between the rich and the poor. Any regulation that is implemented, Walmart would have no problem paying its local grocery chains, which it makes it harder for them to compete with the Walmarts and the Amazons. This is why H. Lee Scott and Doug McMullen, the former CEOs of Walmart, explicitly came out and said, oh yeah, we support raising the minimum wage. They're on Ben Burgis's team when it comes to raising the minimum wage, because they know what it will do to their competition. So statism, socialism, institutionalizing aggression increases the amount of inequality, not just the immoral aspect of it being unequal for some people to have rights that other people's don't. Basically, socialism ushers in an apartheid state where different groups have different rights. And as well as the standard of living approach, where if you want more equality, make sure that people have the most amount of options of where to work and where to purchase products and services from.
The next question is about human nature. Critics say that capitalism works with human nature by harnessing self-interest, whereas socialism goes against human nature by expecting people to share and sacrifice. Ben, you've argued that human nature and socialism can be compatible. Why do you believe people can thrive under socialism without selfishness derailing it? You have 2 minutes.
Okay, so first issue, is human nature basically kind and cooperative, or basically cruel and selfish? Probably the only honest answer is that it's a bit of both. But my basic point would be that the more worried you are about the selfish and cruel aspects of our nature, the more concerned you should therefore be about economic inequality. And this, by the way, connects to something I didn't have a chance to say earlier in my answer about the relationship between freedom and equality, which is that while I certainly wouldn't deny that freedom from interference is important, I actually don't think it's the most fundamental kind of freedom. I think the most fundamental kind of freedom is freedom from domination. And the more inequality you have, the more subject those with less are to the arbitrary power of those with more. The same way authoritarian political systems might not be quite as objectionable if we could all somehow trust dictators not to abuse their power, the fact that we can't trust those with concentrated economic power not to abuse that, not to treat those under their thumb the way Jeff Bezos treats workers in his warehouses or Harvey Weinstein treated aspiring actresses, is exactly why we need to extend democracy to the economy. Saying people are by nature selfish and cruel, therefore we should allow some people to have vastly more economic power than others, is like if I were to say my eyesight is bad, therefore I don't need these glasses. It's exactly backwards. If people were angels by their nature, I wouldn't worry about those with nothing being left to sleep on the streets by those with the wealth to house them, or capitalists abusing their power at the workplace. But we're not angels, so we need to be economic egalitarians instead.
Keith, do you think that socialism is doomed by human nature, greed, laziness, and so forth, in a way that capitalism isn't? You have 2 minutes.
Yes, because of the assumption that collective ownership in the means of production would mean that all these people have a huge incentive to allocate their scarce time on Earth to really inform themselves about something. They'll get a 1 in a million vote on the outcome. The reason that people are so ignorant with regard to politics is not necessarily because it's so hard to understand things. It's that they would have to bear the cost of thousands of hours of reading. And at the end of 4 years, they'd get a 1 in 6 million vote, depending on how big their state is. So because people, when the means of ownership are collectivized, when they get such a small say, they're not willing to bear a large cost and really figure out what is an efficient way to meet consumer demand. How do we make employees happy? Where do we locate our buildings? What should our training practices be? That those incentives just do not match up. So I would say that socialism is in opposition to human nature. When it comes to the mistreatment of employees, this might be the greatest contribution that socialists have to the world. And nothing in capitalism or a free market system would stop them from voluntarily unionizing, creating competitors, or buying stock. If you want the employees to own the means of production, you wouldn't want them to own the place they already work at. You'd want them to diversify their portfolio, work at one place, and own stock in another place in case your business goes out of business. So the socialist doesn't even care to diversify. You could still own the means of production through purchasing stock or some other form of contract. The way we can judge whether, if we just care about the well-being of the workers, we could look at the employment methods of the state and compare it to the working conditions that the market provides. There are a number of terrible horror stories in the private sector, and I totally support Mr. Burgis doing anything within his voluntary means to persuade people to negotiate or get different positions, anything peaceful. That's what I support, including boycotts. I totally respect things like that. When it comes to what governments do to employees, conscript them by the millions, get their limbs blown off in wars that are based on lies or complete fabrications. It's not even close when it comes to the death count. You can look at the American Civil War, where they involuntarily had workers performing to the tune of 600,000 deaths. The First World War, the Second World War, all these governments, when they were shielded from the free market accountability, enslaved people and got them murdered because those people did not have the freedom to disassociate.
The next foundational question for our debaters is on the historical scorecard. Each side points to history to prove their case. Capitalists say that free markets drove the Industrial Revolution and lifted billions from poverty. Socialists fire back that unfettered capitalism gave us the Gilded Age injustices and crashes like the Great Depression. Meanwhile, socialists claim that true socialism hasn't even been tried, while capitalists list the Soviet Union and Venezuela as cautionary tales. Whose historical evidence is more convincing? Which system's track record gives you confidence? And how do you answer the other side's examples, be it the Soviet Union or the Great Depression? Ben, let's start with you again. You have 2 minutes to respond.
Yeah, so I've already said what I mean by socialism. The Soviet Union obviously wasn't that. But sure, if all you mean by socialism is state ownership, the Soviet Union was socialist. Just like if all you mean by capitalism is a society where most people are employed by regular capitalist companies, Hitler's Germany and Mussolini's Italy was capitalist. But the same way I understand that's not the kind of capitalism Keith advocates, the Soviet Union isn't the kind of socialism I advocate, if you do want to call it socialism. I'd say no country in the world has achieved socialism in the sense I advocate, just like I'm sure Keith would acknowledge that the libertarian utopia he dreams of hasn't been achieved anywhere. Now, I would say that the absolute horror show of 19th century capitalism came closest to pure libertarianism, and the countries that have come closest to what I want are the Nordics. They obviously haven't gone all the way to getting rid of capitalism entirely and instituting workers' control of the means of production, but they have come closest. The really bizarre case to me is the attempt to shoehorn Venezuela into this, because not only is Venezuela not socialist in the sense I advocate, there's no definition of socialism that would make Venezuela more socialist than the Nordics are. Even if all you mean by socialism is state ownership, countries like Norway and Sweden are way more socialist than Venezuela is. Look it up. The percentage of the population that works for the public sector in Venezuela is way lower than the percentages in Sweden or Denmark or Norway or Finland. So you have two choices. You could say that all these places are socialist after all, which is, really going to screw with the historical argument against it. Or you could drop the Venezuela argument from your repertoire. But if you're interested in logical consistency, you do have to pick.
And Keith, what's your take on who has history on their side? You have 2 minutes.
I have not visited the Nordic countries. What I do is I go by the Economic Freedom Index. A number of places provide this, the Cato Institute, the Fraser Institute, and they measure the percentage of gross domestic product that is spent by the state and that which is spent by the private sector or the voluntary sector. And in all of those places you mentioned, they are more capitalist than the United States, having fewer barriers to entry when it comes to opening a business, more school choice, more free trade, and lower taxes in general, depending on what your income bracket is. So I would not consider those places to be examples of socialism. I do see socialism as the institutionalized aggression against private property. So I would see whether it's a state or it could not be a state. It could just be a regular committee which does not recognize the right to acquire private property. But the problem that I see with the Soviet Union, the Venezuelans, whether it's East Germany, or you could look at China under Chairman Mao, you could look at North Korea. What makes all of those things immoral is they explicitly do not recognize the right of people to acquire property and exchange it voluntarily. And that is what I'm criticizing when it comes to Mr. Burgis's ideology of democratic socialism. That is what they share in common. I, of course, am not saying that he is, responsible for the Holodomor and trying to usher a second one in. But the primary criticism does still apply. They don't recognize people's right to make voluntary exchanges. They say they represent the workers, but when the workers try to make choices, they actively restrict those choices in all aspects of the economy, whether it's trade or whether it's those workers starting their own business to compete with other capitalists. They constantly want more taxes and regulations. So when I look at history, I try to verify where was the most amount of free exchange and how do those people compare to those with the least amount of voluntary exchange? The pattern that I've come up with is that the more time people have the right to acquire property, exchange it, the more they have the right to exit countries, the more they have the right to choose where to work or start their own businesses, the wealthier they are than they otherwise would have been if those opportunities were restricted.
Okay. Can I actually withdraw a minute or so from my overtime budget because
You got it.
okay. I do want to just say something very briefly about the rankings that Keith has mentioned a couple of times from the Fraser Institute and other places. So I wrote about this for Jacobin a few years ago. The title of that article is the Economic Freedom Rankings Don't Tell Us Anything About Capitalism. And I took a hard look at how the Fraser Institute rankings actually work. And I think even a cursory glance at the results those rankings spring up show you that something extremely fishy is going on. Sweden is more capitalist than Haiti, for example. So despite the fact that in terms of all of the issues that, somebody like Keith and somebody like me would actually disagree on in all of these, right? Sweden is clearly much, much further in my direction, that socialized medicine, the way labor laws work, et cetera, it still somehow comes out as more socialist. Well, what's going on here? And I think you get a lot of insight in that when you start actually zeroing in on the way that the rankings work, which is that they arbitrarily throw together all sorts of different considerations that don't go together. A lot of the considerations, even on their face, have absolutely nothing to do with issues in dispute between defenders of capitalism and, social democrats or socialists. For example, you lose capitalism points if there's inflation. You lose capitalism points if you don't have civilian control of the military, et cetera, et cetera. So all sorts of things that are not in dispute are illegitimately poured in. And you get some really absurd results. I mean, the Fraser numbers will actually tell you that Ukraine became less capitalist from 1980 to 2005, right? So in other words, the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic in 1980 was more capitalist than Ukraine in 2005. I think all they really show, the only things these rankings demonstrate are how creative think tank hacks can be when they're putting a bunch of numbers into a blender and blending again and again and again until they get the results they want.
When it comes to something like the Department of Defense, is that a socialist institution?
Again, if what you mean by socialism is just state ownership, then sure. That's not the definition of socialism I've given, but I can at least understand what somebody who uses it that way means. But of course, Fraser Institute rankings don't track that at all, right? There are lots of countries they'll say are more capitalist despite having smaller public sectors.
When it comes to inflation, if there is a state-created central bank, such as we have the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, and they actively participate in the economy by increasing the money supply through quantitative easing, would that make a country more or less capitalist if they had a central bank and that central bank was engaged in quantitative easing?
I don't think the quantitative easing would make it either more or less capitalist. I think the existence of the central bank, I could understand what you might mean if you said that made it less capitalist. But I think all of this is just an attempt to smuggle the cart before the horse, to say that they have here are bad consequences that we predict from the opposite thing. Therefore, if that happens, that's less capitalist. That doesn't prove anything.
Thank you for clarifying. I'm ready to proceed.
All righty. Our final foundational question is on morality and humanity. Does capitalism or socialism make us better people? Keith, it's been argued that capitalism created conditions for humans to treat each other more humanely, that rising wealth made compassion affordable. Why would a profit-driven system make us more humane? You have 2 minutes.
A profit-driven system is not necessarily something that makes you more humane. All government employees or all employees under a socialist system would still be looking to profit. They'd still want more money. They would want more access to resources. There's nothing about profit which makes capitalism unique. Look at all the politicians, look at all the bureaucrats. They're constantly profiting. They want more money, just like everyone else. What makes capitalism more humane is the freedom to disassociate with people who you don't want reaping the benefits of monetary profit. So you need the freedom to disassociate with them. If I'm a worker who is terrified of being mistreated or heavily controlled over, what I would want is a system where I had so much capital investment that made my labor more valuable because I could work with machines, which made my employer want to pay me more. And I would want so many employment options, something that does not come about as a causal result of socialism, but as a causal result of competition. So if you just care about the well-being of the workers and them getting treated with dignity, give them the freedom to disassociate with bad actors and the freedom to not fund things they totally oppose. Mr. Burgis rightfully called the Israeli ethnic cleansing operation in Gaza what it exactly is. It's basically a mass murder campaign. But the socialist does not recognize our right to freedom to freely disassociate from funding something because he sees it as the potential savior against the inequalities created by the voluntary sector. So if you're worried about people getting mistreated or people being inhumanely treated, give them the freedom to disassociate with bad actors, something only capitalism allows.
Ben, do you buy that argument, or do you believe that socialism's emphasis on cooperation and community would bring out the best in human behavior instead of the worst? In short, which system aligns with moral values and brings out human decency? You have 2 minutes.
I don't buy that argument, no. I have four basic reasons why not. The first is that I know this might sound weirdly conservative coming from a socialist, but honestly, I'm way less interested in some grand utopian project to remake human psychology to be more benevolent than I am in designing institutions that can limit the damage we can do to each other, given the kind of nature that we already have. And like I said earlier, just like I think humans are too flawed to be trusted with dictatorial power in politics, I think the same thing is true in the economic realm. That's why I want economic democracy. And I think we can have that and rising economic trends, prosperity, like I talked about in my opening. I don't think that those goals have to be in conflict at this stage of history. I think we can have both. Second, even if we are going to focus on the goal of making people better, I think few things are as bad for our ability to feel empathy for each other as economic inequality. Capitalism creates so much inequality that we have to learn to step over homeless people and not make eye contact just to function from day to day in a society like this. Under a better system, we might not have to harden our hearts like that. Finally, this goes back to my first point about human nature. One of the reasons that I want a system where we can all collectively and democratically decide how to divide up the fruits of our common labor is that I don't want those with less to have to throw themselves on the mercy of those who have more and hope that they just decide of their own free will to be more humane.
That concludes part one of our debate. Part two will be a rapid fire round of challenge questions designed specifically for each of our debaters after conducting a thorough review of their writings and past interviews on this subject. We'll have 5 challenge questions for each debater, and that's coming up next, right after this message from our sponsor, JM Bullion.
Now is the time to take advantage of the power of gold and silver to grow your wealth, whether you're an experienced investor or new to the game. These precious metals have a long history of being a safe haven for your savings, but they also offer growth potential, making them a wise investment choice.
You guys are both doing a great job.
So where does the average investor go to buy
time,
gold
so
and
we're
silver?
not running. I was
That's
afraid
easy.
every
JM
question would
Bullion.
go overtime. It's all
JM
been
Bullion
pretty
is one of
much
the
right
most
on
popular and most trusted
So,
precious
great
metals
job.
retailers in the nation. We offer a huge selection of gold, silver, platinum, and palladium products that can be delivered to your door in safe, discreet, fully insured packaging. From 1 gram of
Seems like
gold
a great
to an
fit.
entire
I'm
mint
glad
box
that
of
this worked
silver,
out the way it
JM
did.
Bullion
Our
offers
last
precious
minute.
metals to suit every financial goal and budget. No matter your budget, now is the time to start investing in precious metals and start protecting yourself and your savings against these volatile markets. Visit jmbullion.com today to take a look at our wide variety of precious metals, rounds, coins, and bars, and find out how you can turn your savings into gold.
And we're back. Let's dive into part 2, our challenge questions for each of our debaters. We'll start with the first question designed for Professor Ben Burgis, real socialism and historical failures. Ben, whenever socialism is attempted and ends in economic collapse or tyranny, supporters say, well, that wasn't real socialism. But as Keith and others point out, the 20th century saw multiple brutal socialist regimes, and they all brought impoverishment and loss of freedom. From the Soviet Union to Mao's China to more recent examples like Venezuela, we've seen food shortages, repression, even mass killings done in socialism's name. So why do you believe that those disasters don't indict socialism as an idea? Were they doing something fundamentally wrong? Is it not your style or your kind of socialism? And how can we trust that a new socialist experiment won't end up the same way? You have 2 minutes.
So the most basic mistake you can make in probabilistic reasoning is something called the hasty generalization fallacy, which happens when your sample size is too small or too unrepresentative of the population. So for example, if we polled the audience for this debate and found that at least 40% of them had watched at least 2 previous debates about capitalism and socialism, it would obviously be crazy to conclude that 40% of all people have watched at least a couple debates about capitalism and socialism. So in the argument we're considering, we have exactly one example, the entire history of the world, where something that even might be seen as an initial attempt to create a democratic form of socialism turned into an authoritarian system. That's the Russian Revolution, where there was an attempt to leapfrog all the way from semi-feudal agricultural society all the way to socialism, which, as I discussed in my opening statement, Marx certainly didn't think would be possible. That was a disaster. But it's also literally the only one. All the other examples are ones where people who took power were capital C communists who were self-consciously trying to replicate the Soviet model of what they called socialism. People who want to claim that there's a second example in the history of the world of an attempt to create a more democratic form of socialism that turned authoritarian typically cite Venezuela. But as I said, if you care even a little bit about logical consistency, you cannot say that Venezuela is socialist without therefore saying that Sweden and Norway are even more socialist. So let's please be more serious than that. Meanwhile, capitalism, especially when not restrained by a strong labor movement and regulatory state, has generated massive inequality and human misery in hundreds of nations for hundreds of years.
Let's move on to our first challenge question for Keith, the inequality question. Keith, the richest 1% keep getting richer under capitalism, while many others struggle. A handful of billionaires have more wealth than billions of the world's poor. Keith, does capitalism inherently create extreme inequality? And if so, is that just the price that we have to pay for overall progress? Or is it a problem that the free market will eventually fix? Critics say this inequality is a moral failing of capitalism. How do you respond?
I don't think it's unique to capitalism. Every society that I've looked into, start with the ancient pharaohs of Egypt, there was massive inequality. In Greece, the average person was very unequal to Aristotle. In China, the average person was very unequal to Chairman Mao. In Cambodia, the average person was very unequal to Pol Pot. In Argentina, the average person is very unequal to Javier Milei. In all of these examples, every society, we see massive amounts of inequality because of the iron law of oligarchy that I mentioned earlier. Very few people, very domineering personalities are willing to allocate the time and resources it takes to really mobilize people. It's an inevitability in any society. What makes capitalism different is it creates the incentive for those elites to meet consumer demand and worker demand, as which I appreciate, Ben, reprioritizing in my mind to not just think of people as consumers. But there's nothing inconsistent about thinking of people as consumers and workers. I both want them to have more options. I want them to have more time to allocate, whether it's to family, to just reading, to relaxing, or whether they want higher incomes. So no, inequality is not unique to capitalism at all.
Our next challenge question for Ben pertains to authoritarianism. Try that again. Our next question for Ben pertains to authoritarianism versus democracy. Critics warn that socialism, even if started democratically, leads to authoritarianism because the state gains massive control over the economy and thus people's lives. They say power corrupts, and a socialist government might trample individuals' rights, free speech, property, and so forth, in order to reshape society. Ben, how would your vision of socialism avoid devolving into a dictatorship of bureaucrats or a big brother state? For instance, if the government or worker councils were to control resources, what checks and balances would ensure that we don't get a new ruling class in the name of equality? Put another way, how do you have socialism without the secret police and the bread lines? You have 2 minutes.
Oh, I absolutely agree that power corrupts. That's why democratic socialists like me were so ferociously critical of Stalinism during the 20th century, but it's also why we object to a boss having dictatorial power over his workforce. Okay, but the question wasn't about economic authoritarianism of the kind that's foundational to capitalism. It was about authoritarianism in the political sphere. How do you prevent political authoritarianism if you have socialism at the base of the economy? I'd say exactly the same way you prevent it if you have capitalism at the base of the economy. A quick glance around the world shows that newspapers or television stations being privately owned, for example, is no obstacle whatsoever to them being censored by the government. Conversely, there are democracies with state-funded broadcasters that have pretty strong institutional protections of their editorial independence from the government. And of course, the form of socialism I advocate could have plenty of media outlets that were totally independent, subscriber-funded news collectives. As I've said, we have exactly one example in the whole history of the world of something that can maybe be seen as an attempt to create a democratic form of socialism, giving rise to an authoritarian regime. And that was a country, what was the Russian Empire and then the Soviet Union, where you had no prior tradition of democracy, not even a single year of Russia being a democracy in between pre-revolutionary authoritarianism and post-revolutionary authoritarianism. And sorry, I am going to have to take a minute or two out of my overtime budget here because I really want to point out just a few more things about this case and the broader issue. Russia is a place that started with a backwards semi-feudal economy where World War I had ravaged it to the point of absolute state collapse, and then 14 foreign countries invaded them after their revolution. That's your one and only example of a socialist experiment to generating into authoritarianism rather than just starting out that way. Meanwhile, there are many, many examples all around the world of capitalist democracies backsliding into some form of political authoritarianism while staying capitalist. In fact, often the dictators come to power with the support of big capitalists precisely because capitalists worry that the alternative will be socialism. That's how Germany got Hitler, and it's how Chile got Pinochet. So the idea that this is more likely to happen under socialism than capitalism is just not supported by any historical evidence. But either way, how do you stop it? What's the guarantee in any country that once you've achieved democracy, you won't backslide into authoritarianism? Constitutional protections of civil liberties and multi-party democracy are important, of course, but the sad truth is that at the end of the day, words in constitutional documents are only as good as the appetite of institutions and ordinary citizens to stand up to protect those rights when authoritarian politicians start to chip away at them. But I do want to make one last point about this. I think if we're going to ask what kind of economic system is more likely to give you the kind of citizenry that would fight to protect their democratic rights in the political sphere, one where people are accustomed to democracy in their own lives, or one where they're habituated every day to obedience to an unelected boss, I think the question tends to answer itself.
The next challenge question for Keith is exploitation or fair exchange. Socialists often argue that capitalism is essentially exploitation. Owners reap the profits while workers get paid a fraction of the value they actually produce. Keith, why do you disagree with the claim that wage labor under capitalism is akin to a form of theft or wage slavery? What's your argument that a voluntary paycheck is fair exchange and not exploitation? You have 2 minutes.
When someone signs up to take a class by Mr. Burgis, they will inevitably spend thousands of hours doing hard work for $0 and 0 cents an hour. This could be seen as totally exploitative. Mr. Burgess is getting paid, and they're not only not getting paid, they have to take out big loans in order for the school to make tons of money. That could be exploitation. Or you could say that's a choice that someone made because, given the alternatives they had, they thought this was a valuable use of their time and money. I see nothing wrong with this at all. So when we see someone in a vulnerable situation, maybe taking bad working conditions or a bad wage, it is tempting to say, let's outlaw that. Once that is outlawed, the people don't end up owning mansions and skipping through meadows, singing the Sound of Music soundtrack. They end up being in a worse position than they previously were because you took away the one option they had. So given the fact that people can constantly experience exploitation in their everyday life, let's assume exploitation exists, and it's when one person with more power exploits someone with less power. Because if it's just money, you would have to say that stay-at-home moms exploit the surplus value of their husbands. Welfare recipients exploit the surplus value of net taxpayers. We could play that game, or we could just say if human beings, a good default position is if human beings arrive at a mutually beneficial, actually, let's scratch that. Any voluntary exchange where one person has the recognized to opt out or the choice to contract with other people without the threat of violence being used against them, I think that's a much better default position to have. Because, of course, I think the state claiming the right to take 30% of your income is very, very exploitative. Or you could say that the employees are exploiting the bosses. They just go to a place only because those employees want the money from the bosses. If they don't like the job, they'll just pick up and quit. They don't care if the company is operating at a loss. The worker doesn't have to, pay the money that the company loses. And most companies are unprofitable and most companies go under. Are they exploiting the employer? The employer has to do tons of unpaid investment, research and development, coming up with the concept of an idea of what to sell, training people on the job before ever getting paid from the product they're selling. You could say that the employer is being exploited by the employees who are just there selfishly for their own paycheck, and the customers who just walk into the store. Maybe I'll buy something, maybe I won't. I just care if these people can give me resources. I don't see anything nefarious about that. So while it could be seen as unequal, I still respect people's right to freely associate.
Ben, I have another prepared question for you, but I've got a feeling you want to take a minute on exploitation.
Yeah, thanks. So if you read Karl Marx's Capital, which is all about exploitation, Marx's point is absolutely not that what goes on in the labor market isn't a fair market exchange. Never mind that people are being selfish, they don't care about each other, anything like that. His whole claim is that precisely that even if what goes on in the labor market does follow the laws of market fairness, it's still a form of exploitation. Here's how that argument goes. What's the commodity that workers are selling in the labor market? Marx thinks it's their labor power. In other words, their general capacity to work for some period of time. If you rent a margarita machine for a party, what you're paying for is the use of the machine over a certain length of time, not necessarily the number of margaritas that you end up using it to make. Same deal when you rent a human being for 40 hours a week. And Marx says, okay, what's the fair market value of renting a human being? Whatever it takes to maintain that human at a reasonable level of subsistence. But even if they're paid that much, so market exchange fairness isn't violated, it still remains the case that some of the revenue the worker is making for the firm pays back their wages, but there's also part of it that goes beyond that. That's the capitalist profits. Otherwise, why hire the worker? So just like the feudal serf, the modern worker spends part of his time working for himself and part of it working to enrich the ruling class. And since most people don't start out with enough funds to start to own their own means of production, they have no realistic choice but to submit to this arrangement to make a living. That's what Marx means by exploitation, forced extraction of labor by a ruling class.
I want Mr. Burgis and I to go back and forth on this because I feel like we're very close to settling the capitalism and socialism debate that's been going on for centuries. But if we could at least get this down, just for points of clarity. If I work at a company and the company's operating at a loss as opposed to a profit, is there exploitation going on?
So I think that the claim about exploitation is going to be not that at any given moment, right? It's that you're necessarily making a profit. I mean, just the same way that I'm sure from your perspective, if it turns out that any given year, right, the government is let's say spending more on its tax collection service than it's actually making in taxes, I'm sure that wouldn't detract from your feeling that there was theft going on, right? The point is that the system runs on the extraction of surplus labor from the working class, not that at any given time it's necessarily successful.
Assume I'm a consumer under democratic socialism,
Mm,
and I don't necessarily. It's not that I don't care about the well-being of the workers. I just don't have the mental energy to say,
sure.
all right, how many people went into making these AirPods? I don't know them. I'm just going to a place because I want a product for myself. And I will only pay an amount of money that I am willing to give because I value this product more than the money I'm exchanging. Am I, as a consumer under democratic socialism, engaged in monetary or philosophical exploitation.
No, also not if you're doing that under capitalism. You're not actually extracting anything from workers because you don't own the place. But I do just want to pause on this example to note that what you just gave is a really excellent explanation of why just people making consumer choices isn't a good strategy for remedying injustice. That people are not when they're buying the AirPods or whatnot, right? It's just not realistic to think that in that scenario, people are going to be thinking about exactly who's being paid what or anything like that, right? Which is why to solve that kind of collective action problem, you need people to come together in the political sphere in order to enact those kinds of preferences.
If assume that I am a huge admirer of Liam Cosgrove, which I absolutely am, and I want to see him in person just eviscerate Matt Miller as he did so many times at the State Department. I want this so much, but he's not a rich guy. So I'm willing to intern for Liam at $0.00 an hour. Would I have the right to do that under democratic socialism?
Would you have unpaid internships? Maybe. I mean, that's the kind of question that's so fine grained. I don't think that there's a sort of general answer to it that they have or indeed, I mean, look, you could even have outright wage labor, in some parts of the economy. The objection is to, I mean, certainly, if you have somebody who performs some minor service, for a firm, but it's not really their job. They might provide this service for any number of different firms. It might not be realistic or reasonable to think that they're going to get voting rights, at all of them or even necessarily any of them. But the objection is not, do you have a single internship going on anywhere in the economy? Do you have a single instance of wage labor going on anywhere in the economy? Is the overall economic structure such that most of the population has no realistic means of supporting themselves except to submit to economic dictatorship through wage labor?
Under democratic socialism, wouldn't I have to submit to the collective of the grocery store? Before I used to work at a grocery store.
Sure. Me
So
too.
wouldn't they only hire me or vote to hire me if they thought the value I brought exceeded the cost of employing me? How is that any different?
How is that any different? Well, I think that as a worker owner, right, you have a say in dictating wage levels. In other words, that they have that you could actually vote on what the wage scales are, right? So the fruits of your collective labor, right? You have a say in deciding, right? It's the private sector version of no taxation without representation. So presumably, they think in voting to hire you that the result of this will be that all of you, including you, right, will make more for all of them, right? But the point is that it's not being extracted from you by virtue of just the class power of owners. Rather, you yourself have a reasonable voice and vote in setting the distribution of the proceeds.
When I look at the things in the world that I really value, whether it's the show Seinfeld, whether it's the computer that I'm using, whether it's books that I like or houses that I live in, a lot of those did not come about as a result of a democratic vote. It's a few people employing scarce resources, other people more or less following orders while being employed. If I like that kind of arrangement, because I don't want my life filled with meetings where we're all debating every little piece of minutia, couldn't you just allow people to engage in capitalist acts between consenting adults without coercively democratizing them if people just think it's a more efficient way of organizing?
Well, I think I heard two different arguments there. One was about the production of the products themselves, that these things were produced by this system, where there's a sort of implicit worry that a different system wouldn't generate the same results. And of course, that's an argument I'm very happy to have, but I think it's a little bit different from the point that we're pursuing here about exploitation and voluntariness. And I would say that you have a problem here because, sure, there could indeed be people who prefer not to have a choice. Now, I don't think that workplace democracy means that you have to spend all day in meetings. People who work at Mondragon don't have to spend all day at meetings. You could basically have a big annual meeting or two where you elect a council that runs the place the rest of the time, and might even hire managers where it's more appropriate to use that kind of process because they have particular managerial or technical skills. And you could also vote on an operating agreement, which would be much like a union contract, except you don't have to negotiate it with a separate boss. But look, putting all of that aside, I'd say the problem with that, right, is that if you have too much, right, of that capitalism between consenting adults, as I'm sure you'd recognize, we would just draw opposite conclusions from this. The basic structure of the issue is the same for any, right, workplace regulation, right? That they have whether we're talking about minimum wage, workplace safety laws, child labor, sexual harassment, all of them, right? That it could be, right, that there are people to whom it would be worthwhile, given the choice, right, to accept the arrangements that would violate any of those things, right? But the problem is that that if you're just sort of focused on that micro level and you say, oh, say whatever, it's all voluntary, then you end up with circumstances where most people have no realistic choice except to submit to those things. That's the problem.
So I'm sorry, Erik, can I ask one more thing just to see if Ben and I can get on the same page about something? Is that okay?
Go for it. This issue of exploitation is explicitly why we gave you guys the extra 20 minutes. We knew this is where you were going to use it.
When I think of, okay, let's forget the state owning the means of production. Let's forget the capitalists. What I would want to look at in order to see if democracy, everyday democracy, worker democracy, if that's something desirable, what I look at, tell me if these are straw men, please do, is I look at what issues were most heavily debated among the population. People don't talk about agricultural subsidies, but so we can exclude stuff like that. The two things that come to mind to me are 9/11 and COVID-19. These were heavily debated and discussed among people in your average day. You could put probably the existence of Donald Trump on there as something people were constantly talking about. It seems like the average person who brought George Bush's approval rating to 91% after he didn't keep us safe on 9/11, the average person was advocating lockdowns and mask mandates, even though there was no correlation between states that locked down and had mask mandates and states that had lower death rates. So it seems like when the average person attempts to get democratically involved, we still get absolutely terrible results in the two examples where people were most democratically involved in society. Should this make us more skepticism of people's willingness to debate in good faith with democracy? Are my examples valid? What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think that one of those examples is one that we broadly agree on. The other, I suspect there would be more disagreements, but I also suspect it wouldn't be a good use of our time here to go down that rabbit hole. But I think that the general point that there's no guarantee that if you let people engage in democratic self-government, right, make their own decisions about how policies that affect them are going to be. Of course, there's no guarantee that they're going to make good decisions, right? Any more than when it comes to things that you and I would actually agree, are in the private sphere, right? They're things that mostly affect just me, and it's fine for me to make that decision without anybody else's input. There's no guarantee that I'm going to make decisions that that end up being good for me. Of course, humans are fallible, but I don't think the case for democracy rests on some sort of guarantee that people, when they're allowed the right to self-government, will always govern themselves wisely.
Thank you for clarifying. That is the extent to which I wanted to go on this issue. Thank you, Erik.
And I want to thank our producers at Zero Hedge for allowing me the latitude to allow that exchange rather than trying to enforce rigid time limits. That's exactly why I value the Zero Hedge debate series. We have, however, used up a lot of our overtime limit, guys. So let's try to tighten this up. Move on to Ben's next prepared question, which is on economic coordination and innovation. So let's talk nuts and bolts. In a socialist economy, who decides what gets produced, in what quantity, and at what price? Capitalists argue that without the price signal and a profit motive, a socialist system cannot efficiently allocate resources, leading to shortages or waste, and also that stifles innovation, since investors and entrepreneurs can't reap rewards. Ben, what's your response? How would a socialist system figure out, say, how many shoes or microchips to produce and keep innovating new products? Do you envision markets still existing, like co op businesses competing with one another, or something like democratic planning replacing supply and demand? In short, how will socialism deliver the efficiency and innovation that we see from free market capitalism delivering in its own manner? You have 2 minutes.
So I do take the calculation problem, right? That's the problem of how to efficiently coordinate production with fine-grained consumer needs seriously. And it does shape how I think about how viable socialism could or couldn't work. But I also think that libertarians often wildly overstate the scope of that problem, to the point where they seem to suggest that it means that even the kind of expansion of the public sector you get under social democracy, can't possibly work well. And at that point in the argument, I always think about the scene in the Christopher Nolan movie Oppenheimer, where the title character demonstrates step by step with equations on the chalkboard that it must be physically impossible to split atoms. And his colleague, politely waits for him to finish and then says, "Yeah, we actually just split one in the lab next door. Come check it out." Right? We know, for example, that it's possible to do a good job of planning sectors like healthcare and education and getting better results than the free market does, because we've been running this experiment for decade after decade. And by any standard, socialized healthcare is a smashing success. Finland has the best education system in the world. They don't even have private schools, and so on. So there are things we can plan effectively, but the Soviet experience also shows there are some very real limits. I think at this stage in history, we haven't figured out how to get rid of markets entirely without unacceptable inefficiencies. But if we still do need a market sector for consumer goods, it can at least be a market sector of competing internally democratic worker-owned firms, which I think would have to be financed with grants from nationalized banks. That's the model that Bhaskar and Mike and I advocate in that forthcoming book that you plugged when you were introducing me, The Blueprint.
Our next challenge is for Keith. Booms, busts, and bailouts. Capitalist economies have produced incredible growth, but also boom and bust cycles, recessions, panics, the 2008 financial meltdown. When things go wrong, we often see big banks or companies get government bailouts, which hardly seems like free market being in action. Keith, do frequent crises and bailouts mean capitalism is unstable by nature, or were those crises actually caused by government interference in capitalism, in your view? Explain why capitalism shouldn't be judged by events like the 2008 Great Financial Crisis, or if it should, why we should still stick with capitalism despite that kind of turbulence. You have 2 minutes.
The concept that a crisis exists and the solution is to decrease the amount of voluntary exchanges is the classic psychopath test. Anytime a psychopath sees a crisis, they attempt to reap benefits from it at the expense of others instead of creating voluntary avenues for people to resolve the issue. If you have a famine, you could say, well, that was the causal result of capitalism because that's shrinking the economy. Do famines only happen under capitalist societies? Absolutely not. Nor do you have just financial recessions occur in capitalist societies, or wars are a great example of crises that come into existence as a cause result of a deviation from the private property ethic. You coercively fund the wars with taxation, and you violate the private property rights of the people and the buildings you blow up in exchange. So crises are not unique to capitalism. Specifically with financial crises, people will always leave out the existence of a central bank, which has a legal monopoly on the money supply. why they would ignore half of every exchange or half of most exchanges, which do include money, and the central bank which creates that money, is a bit of an indicator as to whether or not we're getting an actual culprit when it comes to financial crises. Essentially, the central bank will artificially lower the interest rate, the rate at which banks lend money to each other, to increase the money supply or the amount of money that banks take out as loans. This increase in the money supply means that some things are funded to such a heavy extent that that creates a bubble that would not otherwise exist if the interest rate changed as a result of people choosing to postpone consumption and save more money. When the interest rate is lower and people spend more, well, then that's okay because you could always raise the interest rate and give people the incentive to save more so they could earn money off that interest. What the state created central bank does is manipulate the interest rate in such a way to where it's the price of money that is changed. Think of the price as a signal wrapped in an incentive. If something has a very high cost, it sends a signal and a potential profit incentive for people to allocate time, money, and resources toward producing that good. That is the closest I could come to approximating one, crises are not unique to capitalism, and even specifically financial crises are not the result of too many voluntary exchanges and a respect for private property.
Our next challenge for Ben is on incentives and hard work. If under socialism the goal is to equalize wealth and have workers collectively own everything, what incentive is there for someone to work harder or to innovate more than the next guy does? In capitalism, the carrot of profit or a promotion or striking it rich motivates innovation and effort. Ben, how would socialism keep people motivated to do unpleasant but necessary jobs, or just to excel and invent if there's no billionaire jackpot waiting? Do you worry about losing the dynamism that competition brings, or do you think that cooperation can be an even stronger motivator when people share the gains? You have 2 minutes.
Well, like I talked about in my last answer, there are sectors of the economy where I'd acknowledge the best practical solution would be to retain an element of market competition, even after moving to workers' control the means of production. But even apart from that very basic ideological concession, I actually don't think this challenge is quite as formidable as it might look. First, on innovation and invention, think about your smartphone, right? And all the things that make it smart: the GPS, the touchscreen technology, the internet itself. Every single one of these elements were innovated in the public sector, in the Defense Department, in public universities, in labs funded with public grants. So we should take the corporate world self mythologizing about innovation with quite a bit of salt. Second, let's talk about the half of the question about hard work at the bottom of society, about getting people to do the dirty and unpleasant but necessary jobs you alluded to. And I'd make just 2 quick points about that. First, this incentive to hard work doesn't exist for people who are born into money. And that's always struck me as a massive contradiction in hard work rhetoric in defense of capitalism. Second, even worker co-ops don't have 100% flat wage scales right now. And I'm sure in a socialist system where worker ownership was standard in whatever sort of market sector we still had to have, they still wouldn't. For a lot of the dirtiest and most dangerous jobs, you would have to offer people more money to take those jobs, given greater background economic egalitarianism, than you would to get people to take more pleasant, rewarding, intellectually stimulating jobs. Of course, that's the opposite of how we do it now, since under capitalism, the way we fill those positions is by having the lowest wage part of the workforce at the bottom of society be desperate enough to take any job they're offered.
Our next challenge for Keith is crony capitalism versus free markets. Many critics, especially young people, say that what we have today isn't true free market capitalism at all, but rather crony capitalism, a rigged game where corporations and government elites scratch each other's backs. Keith, how do you distinguish between real capitalism from the cronyism that we see with lobbyists, subsidies, and bailouts? Is it fair for people to blame capitalism for the sins of cronyism? And if true capitalism hasn't been tried because of all this government meddling, well, how can we ever be sure that it actually works?
It's much like saying, how can you really advocate voluntary relationships if rape will inevitably exist? Well, what you do is you have a principle of voluntarism that you enter into such relationships. So if you have a consistent definition of free markets or capitalism, you can clearly see that cronyism comes about to the extent which companies or individuals or any organization acquires property outside of the voluntary exchange or homesteading or contracting ethic. So, because you have a definition, you can have a true dividing line between cronyism and capitalism, which I would much more closely define as socialism. I'll use the rest of my time just to say one thing about hard work. Japanese Americans came to America basically not speaking a word of English and were put into internment camps by Franklin Roosevelt from his 9066 executive order. By 1959, they had equaled the incomes of whites, and by 1969, they were earning 33% higher incomes than the average American family. Absolutely, hard work pays off in the long run, not in every single case, as you corrected me with the intern case. Not every single case comes about in the way that we would like, but these are general trends which we can appreciate. I hope that answers both questions.
We're down to our final questions in this round. Our final challenge question for Ben is on worker cooperatives. Ben, you advocate for firms to be owned and run by their employees. But under today's capitalism, worker co-ops are already legal, and they do exist. Mondragon in Spain, for example. Yet most businesses are still traditional companies with owners and wage workers. If a worker-run company, or if worker-run companies are a superior model, why haven't they naturally outcompeted capitalist firms when they could in today's existing system? Are there structural barriers to capitalism that prevent cooperatives from thriving? Or do people simply prefer the capitalist business model? In other words, is the rarity of co-ops in today's society evidence that capitalism actually works better? Or is it just that capitalism's playing field is tilted against worker ownership? How would socialism change that equation? You have 2 minutes.
To me, asking why didn't market competition produce workplace democracy if workplace democracy would be better is no different than asking why, if it's better to have minimum wage laws and workplace safety laws and sexual harassment laws and laws against child labor and the rest, why didn't the invisible hand of the free market just raise wages and eliminate unsafe labor practices and fire groping bosses and get children out of coal mines without the state having to get involved? And notice there's an exact parity of reasoning here. After all, before minimum wage laws, employers were legally allowed to pay that higher wage. Before child labor laws, coal mining companies were free to only hire adults. No law stopped secretaries who were tired of being harassed by their bosses from starting competing companies with strict harassment policies. The basic lesson in all of these cases is just that because something is better in human terms, it obviously doesn't follow that doing it gives you an edge in market competition. In fact, sometimes the opposite is true. There's a reason slavery wasn't transcended in the South by having free labor cotton farms outcompete slave plantations. In the worker co-op example, it's a lot easier for a firm, for example, to move from place to place in search of better business conditions, higher profits, if the people who get a vote about whether to do that aren't people who would either lose their jobs or have to pick up their entire lives and move if the firm moves. Similarly, being able to pay sub-minimum wages and cut corner on safeties, for example, makes companies that can do these things more profitable. Without the state stepping in to even the playing field, market incentives will actually tend to punish these things. And I'm going to eat, I know I don't have much left, but I'm going to eat just a little bit more into my overtime budget here to say two things. And first, saying that making a change doesn't give firms an edge is very different from saying that the state coming in to make the change happen will crash the economy. And anyone who thinks that would happen in these cases has a heavy burden of proof. Since the extant evidence from those few really existing worker co-ops that we do have under capitalism doesn't give us an obvious reason to suspect this is the case. Second, what the state coming in to bring about workplace democracy, like a future socialist government in collaboration with the militant labor movement, what that might look like could involve a few different policy tools, from the blunt instrument of, for example, nationalizing Fortune 500 companies and turning them over to their workers, to just changing the funding mechanism for new firms. So the primary mechanism was getting grants from nationalized banks. And notice that everything I'm talking about nationalizing right now are economic institutions that are the cronyist part of actually existing crony capitalism. Institutions propped up by massive state intervention. So even from a libertarian perspective, I'm not sure how many tears you could cry for their lost property rights if this ever happened.
Our final challenge question to Keith is about people over profits. A common critique is that capitalism puts profits before people. For example, companies might pollute the environment or squeeze workers to cut costs, hurting communities. Keith, what's your response to the charge that capitalism, by design, values money over humanity? Do market forces eventually punish bad actors like consumers boycotting a polluter? Or do we need something beyond capitalism to protect people and planet from greed? In your view, can capitalism solve problems like climate change? Or does addressing such issues require moving away from pure free markets? You have 2 minutes.
Again, it is not about profit which makes capitalism unique, because socialists, syndicalists, communists, fascists are always looking to increase the amount of money or property or social status that they have. So again, profit is not unique to capitalism, but the freedom to disassociate with bad actors is unique to free market capitalism, what I'm advocating here. If you look at the earliest computers, microphones, radios, and printers that were ever invented, they took many, many more resources out of the environment than that which occurs today. This was not the result of the state saying you have to save more money in the vast majority of examples. It was entrepreneurs responding to the voluntary profit incentive through competition, which resulted in more efficient products available to more people in more countries than ever before. If you care about the environment, make sure that environmentalists have tons of options in where they can buy their products and how they can spend their scarce money, and make sure that it's profitable for employers to respect the environment um, by using very green energy, which can save on steel, iron, aluminum, the number of inputs that go into the final production process. So people over profit I see as a false dichotomy. It's extremely difficult to make profit in the voluntary sector if you're not meeting the demand of other people in the economy.
And now it's time to move on to part 3 of this evening's debate, which I think is probably going to be nearest and dearest to many of our listeners' hearts. This is where we'll focus on the generational crisis of the vast majority of young adults feeling that our current system of governance and wealth distribution, regardless of what ism you want to call it, whatever it's called, it's corrupt and it's in serious need of reform. I'll ask 4 questions on this topic for both debaters to respond to. The first topic is youth versus capitalism. Polls show that young people today are deeply frustrated by the status quo. In Britain, nearly 8 in 10 young adults blame capitalism for the housing crisis, and 2/3 say that they'd prefer a socialist economy. In the United States, Gen Z and millennials have far lower opinions of capitalism than older Americans, with many viewing socialism positively. To both debaters, why do you think that so many young adults have turned against capitalism? Are their grievances, such as stagnant wages, student debt, high rent, and climate fears, a direct result of capitalism's failures, as they believe? Or are they scapegoating the wrong culprit? And what would you say to the allegation that capitalism is the problem coming from today's youth? We started with Ben in the last round, so let's let Keith kick things off in this round. Keith, you have 2 minutes to respond.
I am 29 years old, so I think I am in this demographic of who you are referring to. When it comes to the things that create the most amount of economic insecurity among me and my friends, it's the big 3 almost always: schooling, housing, and healthcare, the three things that the state is constantly intervening in and increasing its amount of regulations and increasing the amount that it subsidizes. When it comes to schooling, the state in the last 50 years has drastically increased the amount of involvement in education. You could imagine if the Catholic Church had compulsory education, you wouldn't be surprised to see a lot of Catholics going around. So the fact that the state controls education, I'm not too surprised that we see a lot of statists going around. When it comes to the concept of healthcare, people in my generation are extremely furious with the outrageous cost of healthcare. We had a schooling system and a Department of Agriculture which was telling us in order to be healthy, you'll want to eat between 6 and 11 servings of grain per day. That's what socialized medicine has produced in the extent that it currently exists. According to Paul Krugman's book, The Conscience of a Liberal, he says that before Medicare Part D and the Affordable Care Act, the government paid for 44% of healthcare expenses through the VA, through Medicare, through Medicaid. The state is very heavily involved. The problem is not too many voluntary exchanges. In the case of housing, people like Elvis Summers and Jay Austen were creating tiny houses for people so they could just get their foot in the door to have a place to rest, to combat homelessness. And the state, of course, confiscated these because they weren't up to code. That's how socialism tries to reflect the needs of the working masses by confiscating the one opportunity that they choose to live in. So, healthcare, housing, and education. And the other healthcare example, of course, is COVID. They attempted to lock us down and stop us from interacting in public for years on end based on absolute ridiculous science, while the EcoHealth Alliance was funding gain of function research. The problem is not too many voluntary exchanges. The problem is a lack thereof.
Ben, your turn to address young adults' objections to capitalism. You have 2 minutes.
Well, I think that young adults are probably aware that if you want to talk about the effects of socialized medicine, it's probably less relevant to talk about nutritional advice nobody remembers from elementary school than to talk about where in the world you have more successful health outcomes by every single measure. Where in the world you have the option of leaving your job without worrying about losing your health insurance, etc. But putting that aside, I would say that one of the things I find most striking about this question is how it connects with the question earlier about the relationship between capitalism and socialism and economics and democracy or authoritarianism in politics. Because it's really striking to me how little the sentiments reflected in those polls are represented in the political sphere. And I don't think it's just because the generation gap and older people voting more. I think it's because the way economic inequality distorts democracy. But as far as what the polls mean, I don't want to overinterpret them, but I do think those numbers are rooted in some really grim realities on the ground. We might not have real capitalism from a libertarian purist perspective, but in the last 50 years of neoliberalism, we have gone a lot closer to that than we were. And every step we've taken in that direction, the privatizations, the deregulation, the gigification, every bit of it has made our society worse, more stressful, more precarious. So whereas I'm under no illusion that most young people in these polls have a clear idea of what a socialist economy would even mean, and I'm sure a lot of them really just mean Nordic-style reforms, I do still think these sentiments reflect a real and well-deserved dissatisfaction with the massive economic inequality and economic precarity that they've grown up with, and a desire to renegotiate the social contract in a better direction, one that gives more resources and dignity to the working class. My long-term horizons obviously go beyond that, but I do think the majority of young people are on board with at least taking some steps in what I would see as the right direction.
Our next topic relating to the generational crisis is capitalism versus crony capitalism. A lot of young people use capitalism as a catch-all for everything they see wrong. Unaffordable education, corrupt politicians in bed with billionaires, Wall Street bailouts, you name it. But some argue that much of this is cronyism or corruption, not true free market capitalism. Keith, you've noted that after years of schooling and media pushing anti-market ideas, it's truly remarkable that anyone still values free market freedom. Do you think that youth have been taught to blame capitalism for problems actually caused by government intervention and crony elites? How do you explain the difference between free market capitalism and the mixed economy that we currently have to a generation that just sees one big system failing them? You have 2 minutes.
You would want to extract a definition of what you're referring to when you come to capitalism. So, what I would do with them is say, if capitalism is just about making money, does that apply at all to non capitalist enterprises? Do those people just exist as unpaid volunteers? Of course not. They're profit seeking. So, it's not about the concept of making money. Is it about a few people making decisions for many other people? Well, we see this in politics all the time, where a very few amount of people make decisions for tons of people who not only don't get a say, don't even know what's taking place, and the information is frequently classified. So, because of their very shallow understanding of capitalism, I would say that that could be an explanation, and the fact that the state gets to coercively fund its schools, whereas other schools have to get money voluntarily, and it has a unique compulsion aspect to school. The last Democratic presidential candidate was bragging about the enforcement of truancy laws. This is coercing kids to spend their time performing child labor for $0 an hour in government schools. So, yeah, of course. You could even ask them. So, the number of pages in the Federal Register have drastically decreased in the last 50 years since we're, just under capitalism. They'd probably say yes, even though the opposite's true. So, government spending has been drastically decreasing because we used to have, somewhat of a mixed economy, and now we're just totally capitalist. They might say, yeah, that there's less government spending than ever before. There's, no education budget and everything. Everyone always thinks that these things are shrinking when, of course, education, housing, and healthcare government spending has increased in every aspect. So, yes, they're against it because they're ignorant, because they have no incentive to get informed because of democracy. They could spend tons of time getting informed, and yet they would only get a 1 in 10 million vote every 4 years. So, I don't necessarily expect that to change. My goal is just to increase the amount of insecurity socialists feel when they're advocating their ideas. Hopefully, that would do a better job than really informing people.
Ben, do you accept the distinction between capitalism and crony capitalism, or do you believe that what free marketeers call crony capitalism is just an inevitable outgrowth of capitalism itself? Is saying that's cronyism, not real capitalism, just an excuse to dodge blame? You have 2 minutes.
Yeah. First, I just want to express my astonishment at the idea that the American educational system is pro-socialist. I think this is so at odds with the experience of every human being who's ever been through it that I just don't even know what to say about that. It relentlessly glorifies capitalism. We all know this. But no, I don't think that that's a meaningful distinction. I think that thinking you can have massive economic inequality without it translating into massive inequality in political influence is like thinking water can be taught to flow upstream. The usual libertarian dodge that, oh, we'll make the state less powerful, so therefore it'll be less desirable for moneyed interest to capture, spectacularly misses the point for two reasons. And this all goes double for any fantasy of anarcho-capitalism, just having capitalism without a state entirely. First, think about the regulatory capture aspect of the issue. Saying, oh, well, corporations are going to use their influence to weaken the regulatory agencies that protect workers and consumers, therefore let's get rid of those agencies, is like saying that if half the gangsters in some city are getting away with their crimes by paying off cops and judges, saying, oh, I've got a solution. Let's stop prosecuting gangsters entirely so none of them will then pay anybody off. Second, capitalism can't exist without a very large state. In fact, functioning markets of any kind at a large scale couldn't exist without a big state. If libertarians want to take any kind of ideological credit for the successes of real world capitalism, they can't just ignore all the ways every flourishing capitalist economy ever has been propped up by the state, ranging from public roads and utilities to state-backed currency to limited liability corporations to all that basic R&D the public sector does that I was talking about earlier. Not to even mention that protecting private property rights in a wildly unequal society is going to take a lot of coercive power. Do you want companies to just have to spend half their budgets on private militias? Otherwise, you're going to need a big state to protect those property rights, and that state is going to get captured. Crony capitalism is just capitalism in the only form it could ever take in a material reality.
Next, let's talk about addressing youth's grievances. Let's get specific with issues fueling this discontent. Sky-high housing costs, crippling student debt, jobs that don't pay a living wage, and the perception of a looming climate crisis. Many young people feel that the system we have now is robbing them of the future their parents enjoyed. I want to hear from each of you. How would your preferred system fix or at least seriously address these problems? Ben, why would moving toward a more socialist system make college affordable, housing accessible, and jobs decent for young people? And can it tackle big challenges like climate change better than capitalism? You have 2 minutes.
Sure. I think even very modest baby steps in the socialist direction would be huge on all of these fronts. But I do slightly object to the framing about making college more affordable. Education shouldn't be a commodity at all. We should have tuition free public education at all levels, from preschool to graduate school, paid for by progressive taxation and free at the point of service, just like public high school is paid for. That's not some utopian socialist fantasy. That's just Finland, widely held, by the way, to have the best education system in the world. Similarly, on housing, when people in America think of public housing, they might think of housing projects that were exclusively for the poor and were extremely undesirable, or maybe even think of housing in the USSR, certainly not a good model. But looking around the world, we do have lots of good models, from Singapore to Sweden, of very successful systems where big portions of the population at all income levels live in high quality municipal housing or homes on public land. And these systems get the job done in a way that I'm very deeply skeptical that EMB zoning deregulation could ever be enough to do. On climate change, trying to do an energy transition, by just hoping that, enough people express their green values in their buying decisions, is just not going to be sufficient for anything like the scale of what we need, right? What we need is a massive New Deal style public works program to do a rapid energy transition. And of course, that also ties into the part about the jobs, because we could create lots of good unionized public sector jobs in the process. And these are just the reformist baby steps, actually achieving democracy at work, so people could decide together on how to run the place and who gets how much of the revenue. Would be a quantum leap forward in the dignity, autonomy, and material well-being of the vast majority of the population.
Keith, how would a purer form of capitalism or free market policies make life better for young generations specifically? For example, would deregulating housing and education or embracing innovation solve these issues faster than government-driven socialist ideas? Convince our young skeptics out there, and there's plenty of them that are skeptical of capitalism in this audience. How is capitalism going to deliver the goods for them? You have 2 minutes.
We can look at the free education that capitalism provides when it comes to websites online, as I mentioned in my opening statement, YouTube, Odyssey, Internet Archive, the Khan Academy. Using Grok, thanks to people like Elon Musk, we can access more education than we ever could have. If you advocate something like the need for college to be coercively funded by the state, that is an admission that the last 12 years that the kids spent learning absolute nonsense is created people who are in such dire need of education that they absolutely need 4 years, and we need the state to coercively fund it. I would think that you'd want to brag a little more about public education, considering it's 5 days a week, 6 hours a day for 12 years. You'd think that these kids were so brilliant that no politician could ever trick them with propaganda, that they would be immune to falling for logical fallacies and the such. But the reality is that the teachers do not have the incentive to create a very good product or service. So after 12 years, kids know so little that the socialist is demanding, oh gosh, we really need 4 more years of this because the last 12 years was such an unequivocal waste. In the case of healthcare, look at the most regulated versus least regulated things. Something like cosmetics is much less regulated and the cost has gone down. More people are able to access it than previously before, because there was market competition, because there was innovation. If you go to Walgreens, you could look at the stuff that the state does not require a prescription for versus what the state does require a prescription to get. Less regulation, more options, and lower costs as a causal result of competition. And with housing, as I mentioned earlier, people like Elvis Summers, Jay Austen, it's not that these those are two people who were building tiny houses for the cost of between $1,200 and $5,000. This would have come about just as smartphones. Gordon Gekko's brick phone in Wall Street was impressive 40 years ago, and now no one would be caught dead with that. That's the innovation that capitalism can yield us. Or you could say, well, actually, it's not the profit incentive, it's people just wanting better things for the future. That's totally fine. Then just fund those voluntarily. Just let us opt out of what, frankly, we think are just disasters, such as, state schooling. I think it's a complete waste of time, and it's unpaid child labor, and I would much rather kids have jobs when they were much younger, getting their foot in the door and getting on the job experience so they could gain skills in the workplace. Just let us opt out. That's the only capitalism response that I have.
Our final topic in this round will be an elevator pitch to the next generation. Imagine you're speaking directly to a 22-year-old who's watching this debate and feeling frustrated and cynical about their economic future. They're asking, what does your side have to offer me personally? Why should I believe in capitalism or socialism? Keith, what hope can capitalism give to that young person who's worried about inequality, climate, and living standards? You have 2 minutes to sell your case before the elevator arrives at your executive suite on the top floor.
For the same reason we should have religious freedom, we should have economic freedom. People should be free to make voluntary exchanges with their friends, their coworkers, their employers, with potential customers, in the absence of a third party coercively intervening and attempting to exploit both consenting parties. I'm very happy that the Me Too movement has brought consent front and center in the discussion. Consent is what differentiates slavery from work, rape from lovemaking, theft from trade, and kidnapping from spending time at a friend's house. Consent is the root of morality. We should extend the principle of consent to the economic sphere, allowing the average person to have the most amount of job opportunities, the most amount of access to products and services that they could have. Embracing consent is not only the moral approach, it gives people a higher standard of living because you have entrepreneurs competing for the dollars in your pocket. Don't make it easy for them. Don't give them a big state that they could just tax the money away from you. Make them work for it.
Ben, what hope can socialism give them that it won't just become another failed experiment, but that it will genuinely improve their lives? In closing this segment, tell the younger generation why your vision isn't just an abstract ideal, but something that could actually make their lives and futures brighter, and why the other side's vision would not. You have 2 minutes.
Well, as those polls you quoted earlier show, a majority of young people already understand that what we've got right now has failed them. The thing that's failed them isn't the fact that they get to go to public school. I'll note, by the way, that argument we just heard against public school would equally be an argument against private schools, because, in fact, a much higher percentage of people in private schools feel the need to get 4 more years of education at the end, and somehow no rich people anywhere, right, encourage their kids to drop out at 16 when they're allowed to. So that's interesting to me, right? But they know that what's failed them is what is increasingly a form of capitalism that, however long the legal code is, however many dollars are in the overall government budget, has fewer protections of workers and consumers against capitalists doing whatever they want. They don't necessarily know what could or should replace them, this system, and many of them don't really believe deep down that anything could replace it. Capitalism just feels like the only way things could be, like it's part of the permanent fixture of reality. But slavery once felt like that. You'd be hard-pressed to find an abolitionist in ancient Rome, for example. Even most slaves wouldn't have thought that slavery was something that we could ever get past entirely. They might have dreamed of escaping or earning their individual freedom, but some people being masters and some people being slaves was just how the world was. Now we know it didn't have to be. And I would argue that some people being wealthy business owners and other people having to do what those two people told them all day isn't how things have to be either. But here's maybe the most essential point. Maybe you can't stretch your imagination to the point of thinking we could ever get rid of the system entirely. But even so, I think the majority of young people are realizing this part. Every incremental step we've taken in the direction of taking over society from wealthy business owners and running it in the interests of everyone makes our society better. We're better off we take some of the wage setting authority away from capitalists with minimum wage laws. When we take some of their authority to decide how work processes get done with workplace safety laws. When we create those public schools and public libraries and public fire departments. Meanwhile, every step we take in the direction of a pure, more libertarian form of capitalism makes our society worse, makes it crueler and stupider and more unequal. Every privatization, every round of deregulation, every tax cut for rich people at the expense of slashing services for the poor. So whether or not you believe that we can make it all the way in my direction, let's at least hurry up and go some of that way.
And that concludes part 3. In part 4, the final round of tonight's debate, we'll hear closing arguments from each debater along with their rebuttals to their opponent's closing arguments. And that's coming up next, right after this message from our sponsor, JM Bullion.
At JM Bullion, excellent service and competitive pricing aren't just goals, they're our standard. Our commitment to customer discretion and privacy with secure and confidential transactions has earned us an unparalleled reputation as an online retailer of precious metals, backed by over 375,000 reviews, averaging 4.8 out of 5 stars. Only at JM Bullion. At JM Bullion.
And we're back for closing arguments in tonight's debate on capitalism versus socialism. In this final round, each debater will have 5 minutes to make their closing arguments. I started with Keith in the last round, so let's start with Ben in this round. Ben, you have 5 minutes to make your closing arguments. The stage is yours.
Thank you. So I think that when we're thinking about the sort of big issue here about capitalism and socialism, it's important to take a long step back and think about all the different ways that society can be organized. In 1861, Abraham Lincoln was giving a speech about why the free labor system in the North was better than Southern slavery, which is, of course, is something that, Keith and I can get together on. But the interesting part is that even in 1861, Lincoln was sensitive to worries that the emerging system of industrial capitalism left something to be desired. He said that there is no such thing as a free man being fixed for life in the condition of a hired laborer. That line makes him sound like a socialist. He wasn't. His political vision was limited to, replacing slave labor with wage labor. But he acknowledged that the capitalist system wouldn't be a system of deep and genuine freedom if workers had to spend their whole lives as workers and could never afford to break out of that. But he insisted that this wouldn't be how it would go. The prudent, penniless beginner in the world could work as a hired laborer for a while. Then he could save up a surplus with which to buy tools or land for himself, work on his own account for a while, and eventually hire another new beginner to help him. And as much as I admire Lincoln, if we're honest about this, the idea that everyone who's sufficiently hardworking and prudent can be upwardly mobile through the class hierarchy was already wishful thinking in 1861. Even then, there were only so many lifeboats out of the working class. In 2025, I hope it's obvious to everyone that things can't work out the way that Lincoln was talking about for the majority of the population. The arithmetic doesn't work. In any technologically advanced modern economy, most labor is going to be done by groups of people working together. The world of small farmers and independent craftsmen is not coming back. And while class mobility, certainly exists, I wouldn't deny that, it's just not structurally possible for most of us to be capitalists any more than the laws of gravity would allow the majority of cheerleaders forming themselves into a pyramid to be at the top level. Our choices are that most people will work communally but be ruled by capitalists, right? Private business owners who can manage their little economic fiefdom like kings and queens, or that will continue to work communally but extend democracy to the half of our waking lives that most adults spend at work through some form of collective ownership. Now, Keith has argued throughout the debate that, the sort of check that on capitalist, power in the workplace is our freedom of exit, right? You can always quit and get another job. But I would really suggest that this isn't going to take you that far. That in a lot of ways, this would be similar. If you think back to the way marriage laws used to work, there was something called coverture, where a lot of a married woman's rights would go to her husband after they got married, and she couldn't build up her own property and all of that. And if we still had that, but we also made divorce really easy, that would mean that sure, it would be easy to go from one husband with that kind of authority over you to a different husband with that kind of authority over you. You'd have that freedom of exit, but you wouldn't have voice in the arrangement itself. And that's a really crucial distinction. Never mind, of course, that in both cases, workers now or wives back when this system was in place had to find a new master very quickly before their savings ran out. And of course, in the workplace case, if you apply your freedom of exit too many times, you've got a lot of embarrassing gaps on the resume, and it's going to be difficult to find your next position. So again, I think realistically, this is just not that kind of check that can do the level of work that Keith wants to make it do. Now, he talks a lot about voluntariness, right? The voluntary sector, for example, right? As his name for the private sector. But again, voluntariness in this context is just going to be a red herring. Any possible distribution of scarce resources is going to involve some sort of coercion to enforce that against people who are encroaching on whatever arrangement you've ended up with. So the real question is never voluntary or not voluntary. It's always, what's our theory of who should have what? Is it a Lockean theory where if you mix your labor with with nature, you thereby get rights to it, which I've got to say has never been very compelling to me. I mean, it's sort of it often feels like my dog's theory of property rights, which is that she acquires rights to things by relieving herself on them. Or is it going to be, for example, a Rawlsian theory, according to which the right distribution, the just distribution of resources is the one that you would choose if you ended up having the short end of the stick? I think it's the second one, or something much closer to that is going to be the more plausible theory. But this is the point I just want to end on. I think that's where the real debate lies, right? It's not about coercion versus no coercion. You're always, any kind of exclusion of some people from scarce resources is always going to rest on coercion. The important point is, what's the distribution that should be enforced? And I think a much more equal one is going to be much better for human dignity and flourishing.
And Keith, you have the last word. 5 minutes to make your closing arguments. The floor is yours.
When you look at the great crimes of, let's just stick with American history, it's commonly recognized that there were atrocities against the Native Americans. Some people initiated violence against other people, and we had an unjustifiable double standard. Well, it's not our fault. They were just savages, and we improved on the land, so initiating violence wasn't that big of a deal. Yeah, it's okay that we coerce some people into performing labor against their will, whether it's because they're less intelligent, because they come from less primitive societies. There was another blatant double standard that we are still paying for to this day. What capitalism's advocating is us dropping this double standard and not allowing some people to initiate aggression at the expense of others. Regardless of what your theory of property rights is, it's still inconsistent if there's a socialist state where one group has a unique right to initiate taxes against the rest of the population. That's what makes this an inconsistent theory. Even if you said, well, it's just about making sure there's enough for everyone. Well, then why is it that the state has a unique monopolistic right to initiate taxes? If it's something totally legitimate, allow everyone to initiate taxes. This was the great disagreement between George Fitzhugh in his book, The Sociology of the South, and Abraham Lincoln. Mr. Fitzhugh wrote in his book that slavery is a great paternal institution. Instead of the slave being free and then having to compete in the dog-eat-dog profit-seeking voluntary sector, the slave is taken care of. He's given a home for free. He's given a place where he can have a shower. He's given healthcare. He is under the ownership of the slave owner. This concept of voluntarism we should ignore and focus about really caring for people to the point of enslaving them. This is what I refer to as domestic imperialism. The progressive will rightfully say that America should not be using the government to enforce laws on people in Haiti. The government of Britain should not be forcing itself upon people in South Africa. Yet they say that that same government has the right to initiate coercion against its domestic population. It's the very principle of imperialism that they reject in a distant geographical area. They embrace it when it comes to people who happen to live in a closer geographical area. This is today's double standard that we need to reject. This is the double standard which allows people to fund mass murder campaigns in Gaza, in Ukraine, in Iraq, in Libya, in Yemen, in Afghanistan, because we haven't taken this principle of voluntary exchange and extended it to members of the state. I'll end with a story out of Kansas City, Missouri. The health department is speaking out after it poured bleach on food intended to be given to the homeless. Nellie McCool, who helps run Free Hot Soup Kansas City, has been helping the homeless for years until Sunday. Quote, officers and health inspectors demanded we destroy our food, and we were violating the health code violations by sharing meals with our friends, said McCool. The department said the group wasn't following the law about serving the homeless. Quoting Dr. Rex Archer, the director for public health in Kansas City, Missouri. They were notified back in a meeting in September that they needed to get a permit, and they just outright said they refused to do that. McCool disputes that, claiming someone in their group got upset and threw food on the ground. Inspectors then poured bleach on the food to make sure no one ate it. That is the domestic imperialism you get with the state. When some people literally believe they have a better claim to the property you've justly acquired and your time and your body, and they separate themselves in an apartheid state where they have rights to do things to you, you don't have rights to do to them. That is the nature of our problem in society. We keep embracing double standards. It's time to embrace free market capitalism and reject double standards. Zero Hedge and Mr. Burgis, thank you guys for your time.
Thank
And
you.
before we wrap up tonight's debate, I want to personally thank both debaters for their maturity and professionalism. We had no ad hominem attacks. I didn't have to do anything as moderator to moderate any disputes, and I really respect both of you for coming to such a heated topic with such a respectful approach. Before we close, I want to invite both of you to share your X handles, website URLs, and so forth for the benefit of any listeners who may want to follow your work. Professor Ben Burgis, where can people follow your work and what will they find when they get there?
Sure. You can read me at Jacobin Magazine, where I'm a columnist, or at my Substack, which is called Philosophy for the People. That's benburgis.substack.com. My podcast is called Give Them an Argument, and that is every Monday night at 8 p.m. on the East Coast, so 5 on the West Coast where I am. And you can pretty much find what you heard tonight.
And Keith, please tell our listeners where they can follow your work and what they'll find when they get there.
For people interested in the libertarian philosophy or the philosophy of social cooperation in opposition to violence and coercion, they can check out libertarianinstitute.org, where we have a free educational online archive. You can use our search engine to type in any issue you're interested in: agricultural subsidies, central banks, Israel, Ukraine, and you can check out all the free materials we have there. You can also find free PDFs of my 2 books. One is the Voluntarist Handbook, the 50 articles and essays that I read, which took me from being a progressive to being a libertarian, as well as a speech I gave titled Domestic Imperialism, 9 Reasons I Left Progressivism. That is where I quoted the previous article from. Thank you guys so much for your time. You can also check out my podcast, Don't Tread on Anyone, on YouTube and Odyssey.
And for my part in this, Macro Voices is the only investment and macroeconomics podcast that specifically targets professional finance, family offices, and sophisticated private investors. We differentiate from other podcasts by asking all of our guests not to dumb it down to a retail level. You can subscribe to Macro Voices wherever you get your podcasts or find more information at macrovoices.com. And for those of you, and I know you are, who've been eyeing that beautiful ZeroHedge ball cap over my shoulder, you can find that and a whole bunch of other really cool ZeroHedge merch at zhstore.com. For the ZeroHedge debate series, I'm Erik Townshend.